The committee of the whole is now back in session. Before we broke for our lunch break, we had an amendment by Senator San Nicolas, and I know Senator Espadon had a question. I'll go and recognize Senator Espadon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, this is not an easy one to solve. And like I said, when I asked the question about this amendment to the amendment, that any reorganization authorized by this act shall not affect any ongoing administrative or judicial proceeding involving any agency, instrumentality, or public corporation, I fully understand where the good senator is coming from who proffered this amendment. There is the other side, though. I'm not sure it can be resolved at this point. I'm not objecting to it, but I do raise concerns that this could impede any reorganization that needs to take place or that the governor might want to start. But I'll leave it alone for now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Espadon. Anyone else on the San Nicolas amendment? If not, we'll ask the Senator San Nicolas to close on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just some clarity on the purpose of the amendment. Basically, what it reads, any reorganization authorized by this act shall not affect any ongoing administrative or judicial proceeding involving any agency, instrumentality, or public corporation. By adding this provision into the amendment that's proffered by the original author, the agency won't be able to have reorganization take away the due process proceedings that it's undergoing at the time of the reorganization. So for example, if there's a bid that's been put out and a protest has been filed, no reorganization action can supersede the proceedings of that protest. Or if there's a grievance filed by an employee or a group of employees, no reorganization proceedings can supersede the due process of those employees. Or if there is any other litigation, any lawsuit out there that is currently being entertained or at the that is affecting a particular agency, instrumentality, or public corporation, no reorganization can affect the due process of that particular lawsuit. But just to be very, very clear, the way the amendment is written is that any reorganization authorized by this act shall not affect any ongoing legal actions. So basically, you still can reorganize the agency. You can reorganize it 99.9%. You just can't take that one extra step that would somehow impede any administrative or judicial proceedings. So the amendment will not get in the way of reorganization in total. It just will make sure that there's no actions that can be taken as a result of reorganization that may impede any of these judicial proceedings. That's the amendment, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator San Nicolas. Was there an objection to this amendment? There was no objections to this amendment, so if there's no objection, motion carries. We are on the Ugun amendment still. Senator San Augustine, did you have an amendment? Oh, I'm sorry, you still have the floor, Senator San Nicolas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess for the purpose of clarity, as I'm reading the amendment, the way it would work, I think the language might need to be reconsidered, and if I could ask for the attention of legal counsel. For example, on subsection 2203, absorption of functions, it reads, the governor by executive order may direct the absorption of any or all of the functions of any one agency of the government listed in Table 1 with a priority number of 200 or higher by any agencies of the government with a lower priority number. Now, I think that last section there with a lower priority number might create, just by virtue of the operative language, it might create a situation where if you have, let's say, agency 204, or I'm sorry, agency, let's say you wanted to merge an agency with a higher number into an agency with a lower number, you wouldn't be able to do that by the strict interpretation of how it's written. Everything would only be able to be merged into something of a higher number. Because of the way it's written, it says that you can only absorb it with a lower, you can only, a higher number can only absorb a lower priority number. But you may have agencies of lower priority that you want to merge something of on a higher priority number into. So I think that it shouldn't be based necessarily on chronological order of the numbering. It needs to be based on the groups. So the governor, by executive order, may direct the absorption of any or all of the functions of any one agency of the government listed in Table 1 I think that we need to make it very, very clear that anything in group 2 or group 3 can absorb any other agency so listed in group 2 or group 3. Like, for example, any agency in group 1 may absorb any of the functions in groups 2 and 3, and any agencies within groups 2 and 3 may absorb the functions of any other agencies within group 2 or 3. I think that's how it needs to be written.
Are there any objections? No objections? Motion carries.
And if I can just make the same clarification on section 2204. Well, I guess that one's okay. So basically, anything in group 3, the governor by executive order may abolish any agency of the government listed in group 3, but I guess that's everything 300 or higher. So I'll withdraw that, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
We're satisfied. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Senator Siniclis, is there anything else?
That's all.
You're good.
Mr.
Thank you. Senator San Augustine?
Mr. Chairman, I just got, you remember how I was trying to address the listing? And exactly what the Senator Snickers brought up is that you can absorb from 3 into 2 or 2 or 3 into 1. Being that already there are several agencies listed on 3 that is already into 2 because of the movement of Chamorro affairs. Is there any way they can clean up this list and just show that they're already there, and then we'll know what else is left? I don't know. I'm just trying to, because you remember they brought up Guam Museum as part of it. KGTF is part of Chamorro affairs. Then we should put them where they exist today, because they may stand alone per se, but they're not. It's still under one office, and I'm just very curious. And if not, then no objection to it at all.
All right. Thank you, Senator San Augustine. Anyone else on the Uggan amendment? If not, I'll ask Senator Uggan to close.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to thank our colleagues for the contribution to this particular amendment. I think enough has been said in regards to the need to be able to restructure and reorganize our government and allow for cutting the red tape. And it really comes down to cutting the red tape and streamlining our government services so that we can focus primarily on the core services of the government of Guam, which are education, public safety, and healthcare. So I ask our colleagues for their consideration and their support of this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Uggan. On the Uggan amendment, are there any objections? No objections. Motion carries. Senator Uggan, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to request that I continue to reserve the balance of my time and come back and entertain some subsequent amendments. I know that some of our colleagues would like to also have their amendments addressed. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Uggan. So now we'll entertain the amendments that were circulated last week by Senator San Augustine and Senator Esteves. We'll go ahead and recognize Senator San Augustine. You have 3 separate amendments.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not too sure which one you have, but I do have a change to those amendments that and I have it here, and I'll have them pass it out now.
Senator San Augustine, we have one now on sections 26701. Your amendment?
Yes, sir.
Okay. please
Mr.
proceed.
Chairman, the amendment reads that the change would be to add to line 6, to add that at the end of the 2%, provided, however, that any such service may elect to opt out of paying said general sales tax if and only if such service pays business privilege tax of 6%. Basically, Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, we've all received calls. It was in the hearing that such as the banks felt that they didn't know how to handle sales tax. So by giving them the opt-out, which the Department of Revenue and Tax, I spoke to Mr. Camacho earlier, that they will create the form, they will elect to opt out, but their GERT will increase to 6% from currently from 4%. And then the same token, I've gotten calls from GHRA, they did testify about their duty-free status, that they wanted to protect their industry down there, and that gives them the option to opt out. Now, the second amendment will relate to the first amendment that would create the new section there. That new section talks about business privilege tax applicable to a business who opts out of general service. A new section 26202.2 is hereby added to chapter 26 of Title 11 Guam Code annotated, and then it reads further, notwithstanding 11 Guam Code annotated 2602, any service business who elects to opt out of paying the general sales tax established by Title 11 Guam Code annotated 26701 shall pay a business privilege tax equivalent to 6% of the gross income of such business. That's why that was offered.
Thank you, Senator. On the San Augustine amendment, are there any discussions? Senator Esteves and then Senator Ogun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the intent of this amendment. However, I don't believe as it's written, this particular amendment would cover the retail industry with regards to the proposed or supposed duty-free shops located in our tourist district. And I'd like to ask the sponsor of this amendment if he could elaborate a bit more as to whether or not I'm reading this correctly or how this can apply to the retail industry, tourism retail industry. And then another question I'd have for him as well is what's the intent of proposing? How can a business choose to opt out if a tax is being levied against them? And how can that be tracked and recorded?
Senator, would you yield?
Number one, the tracking is handled by Revenue and Tax. I would ask Mr. Camacho if he can answer that. How would they be able to track the sales tax?
Yeah, I guess upon reading this amendment, basically having the businesses, actually it's basically only the service business to opt out. I think we can devise a form for those businesses. We can, I know when they had the visible tax, I think there was an election that was made, something similar to that, where they come in and they're saying that they will opt out of the sales tax and basically pay the 6% tax, I guess provided under this other amendment that Senator San Augustine is putting in.
Follow-up question for the director, Director Camacho. Do you believe that, first I'd like to start out with just my concerns with the enforcement of this, because it seems more incumbent upon us to generate the language to reinforce the intent, I believe, Mr. Chairman, Because other than an audit of an individual tax filer, I don't see how it can be enforced, provide for easier enforcement on a month-to-month basis. And I'm wondering if the director can elaborate on how they can ensure that, because you have one business on one hand, is it an opt-out provision? Because it's an opt-out provision only on the 2%. They're still going to be required to pay the 4% if that tax is levied against them. But with regards to a hybrid, if they opt out of paying the sales tax or the GRT in lieu of the BPT, how will we really be able to know that they're actually filing and paying that additional 2% on a month-to-month basis? And the only reason I ask is I don't want this to be an issue, or this to be discovered an issue only after which we find out that there are many taxes in arrears and they're only being identified via audit on that 2%. So I don't know if there's any more information you can provide to this body on guarantees that enforcement will still be able to continue. Because it's not like any other tax. Any other tax, it's very simple. You pay tax A, you pay tax B. But I think with discussions of an opt-out provision allow for you pay tax A, but you can either pay tax B or tax C, and whether or not we'll be able to stay current, and what other provisions would be necessary if they wanted to opt out of the opt-out or opt back in. I think there are many things still unclear, and to the director's point, Mr. Chairman, it still hasn't really reiterated or highlighted how this is any benefit to the retail sales in their tourist industry.
I know this is something that this opt-out issue or amendment, I think we can, Department of Revenue Taxation would actually get together and devise probably some kind of a form that will have on the form the election at the same time, basically have the form have both BPT at 6% and sales tax at 2%. So upon the election, the taxpayer will indicate on the return that they have elected to opt out on the 2%, and therefore basically filing the grocery tax will be placed on the 6%. In other words, that's something that I'm thinking, something that's new to me right now, but it's something that maybe my staff and I would get together and come up with a rules and regulation to adopt these things, basically to inform that taxpayer that if you opt out, that means you're going to have to be reporting on the grocery receipt at 6%. If you did not opt out, then you will show that you will be reporting GRT on the 4% and 2% sales tax. These are things that are just coming out, of my mind, how we can address this opt-out issue.
Thank you. And I think my concern's not necessarily on the forms or really the final product on the rules and regulations, but what I have concerns with is really the calculation. Because with the GRT as it is, once you put the whole taxable income in on the gross when you're doing your filing, whether online or manually, then that 4% is taken off the top. Now, if a business chooses to opt out, or if they're paying multiple taxes based on their industry, will it show? Do we have enough grasp of the current system we're using to ensure that it doesn't reflect on the business that they owe when in fact they don't, because they paid a separate tax on the monthly returns?
Yeah, I guess what I can basically say right now is that we'll look at it and see how we can best apply it. But I think we can work on something basically that would basically have the taxpayer, once the taxpayer opt out from the sales tax, that means that he's basically, reporting on the service side, 6% GRT. I think some of the questions that may arise is that what happens if taxpayers have multiple businesses? And those are things that we probably say, once you opt out, that means that you have no choice but to pay 6% on all your businesses, in other words, that are service, in other words. I think this one doesn't apply to retail because it only talks about service. So those are things that are coming out of my mind right now. So
That's what I'm tracking to as well, Mr. Chairman, and I just wonder if the provisions of this, if the opt-out is being provided to a service business, would we potentially want to look at some of the other industries like construction and rental as well? At this time, I'll just go ahead and allow for my colleagues and their input, but I'm still really mulling this over, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to reserve time to come back based on further discussion.
All right, thank you, Senator Esteves. Anyone else on Senator San Nicolas?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment to the amendment presents several problems. The first is that while the original this is an amendment to the bill. While the original legislation seeks to create a sales tax, this allows for an enterprise to opt into a higher gross receipts tax instead of paying the sales tax. The problem is that we're talking about two different types of taxes here. And the gross receipts tax has many existing exemptions. So any service business that has an existing exemption from the gross receipts tax, or any service business that has a qualifying certificate that exempts them from the gross receipts tax, if they opt into the higher GRT as this amendment is proposing, they'll basically escape the tax altogether. So it's important for us to, if we're really seeking to have all enterprises treated equally with the implementation of this tax, we can't allow some to reclassify it as a gross receipts tax, because those enterprises that have exemptions or qualifying certificates to the gross receipts tax won't pay. And what may also end up happening is that we'll have some service businesses that have the exemption or have the qualifying certificate in the same industry as other businesses that don't, and all of a sudden you'll have an unequal marketplace where those who do have the exemption or the qualifying certificate and do opt into this provision will be paying less taxes than those who do not have those exemptions or qualifying certificates and are stuck with the sales tax. And so by having a higher tax on their side, they're going to end up, being less competitive than their counterparts who do have those exemptions or do have those qualifying certificates. So I find this to be problematic in that regard, and because of that, I would need to object to the amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Anyone else on the San Augustine amendment? There's been an objection to the amendment. Before that, though, also the clerk had brought to my attention that there was an amendment that was made last week. Senator Uggan proffered an amendment that would have, on this same section, and I'll read the amendment that was passed, as provided, however, that this section shall not apply to the purchase of liquid or diesel fuel sold at sales outlets located in Guam. And so that amendment is now part of this 26701. If it's all right with the body, we'll leave it up to to legal counsel to make the adjustments on this section, should this amendment of Senator San Augustine pass. Vice Speaker?
Could we also get clarification from legal regarding the amendment says notwithstanding 11 GCA 26202, which is where they list out all the exemptions, or a lot of them. Oh no, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong, wait. I guess I just want to make clear, it was my first reading of this that that the opposite was going to occur, that if you opt out of the sales, then you're going to pay 6% business privilege whether you were previously exempt or not. And I guess that seems crucial to the issue, if we could just get clarification.
Okay, we'll take a 1-minute recess.
going to withdraw.
Senator San Augustine, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to withdraw my, my amendment.
Okay.
Thank you.
motion, Okay. Any objections to that? None. Senator San Augustine, you still have the floor. You have another amendment?
No. The other amendments were,
Oh, okay, that's the same one.
right, it was a combination of them.
Okay. Senator, you're done?
Yes.
Okay. We have Senator Esteves and then Senator Ada.
Mr. Chairman, I'm still waiting on some updates to the amendments being printed out, so I'd like to allow for my colleagues to continue discussion while I wait for those.
We are now on the main amendment, on the main bill before us. Senator San Nicolas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have an amendment to propose on the main bill before the body. If I may request for the Sergeant at Arms to make necessary copies and so circulate. Test.
Senator, if you don't mind, if we can move on to another senator
Sure.
while we get that copied. Senator Tom Ada, or Senator Uggan, did you have an amendment on the main bill?
Test.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, if I can get the assistance of the Sergeant at Arms, and I'd like to proffer an amendment that had been proffered in a previous piece of legislation, Mr. Chairman, and was fortunate enough to get the support and the endorsement of majority members in the halls. So I certainly hope that this would also have similar results. This is a provision, Mr. Chairman, that reads, notwithstanding any other provision of law, rule, or regulation, policy or procedure, pay plan, or compensation plan to the contrary, the salaries of all appointed officials whose positions are set forth in the attached Exhibit A, which is in the back of the amendment that's being circulated, shall be restored to the respective salary rates that existed prior to the enactment of Public Law 32-208. The salaries of the Chief of Police and Fire Chief shall be set pursuant to Public Law 32-203. So, Mr. Chairman, I believe we've already expounded and discussed this particular amendment in a previous discussion, and I'd just like to say that we certainly need to look at ways in which we can trim some of the costs associated with our government. And I was reading, interestingly enough, an article that was titled "The Secret to Cutting Government Waste: Savings by 1,000 Cuts." And the focus of that is really looking at individual incremental reductions, and in this particular case, based on information provided by BBMR, the administration, that this will result in a $503,000 cost reduction as it applies to the use and the application of the general fund. So, Mr. Chairman, I ask for the consideration of our colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Uggan. On the Uggan amendment, any discussion on the Uggan amendment? Senator Lee? Senator, you yield?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to the good senator for that inquiry. The figure that was provided to the legislative body regarding a separate piece of legislation, that this would result in approximately $503,000 a year cost reduction in general fund use. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Lee, does that answer your question? Okay. Any other senator wish to be recognized? Are there any objections to the Uggan amendment? There's an objection to the Uggan amendment. Okay, all those in, sorry, Senator Nelson?
But I'm just wondering if if this is germane to what we're doing now. I mean, I think that I wouldn't have any issues perhaps if there was a public hearing regarding this amendment. But just for your ruling, Mr. Chair.
Okay, we'll take a brief recess while I consult with legal counsel. Okay, we're back on. After consulting with legal counsel, it would be the ruling of the chair that this amendment is not germane. However, I'd like to place this before the body, and if the body may choose to do so, can overrule the ruling of the chair. Senator Ogden, I recognize you. The ruling is after consultation with legal counsel that this amendment is not germane to the bill in front of us. However, I place the question before the body, and if there's any motion to overrule the ruling of the chair, I'll welcome that at this time. Senator Ogden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move motion to accept the proposed amendment and to overrule the decision of the chair in regards to the germaneness of this particular item. And in reference to the question that was posed a little earlier by one of our colleagues previously, this particular piece of legislation in regards to the reduction of cabinet members' positions, as it is highlighted in the back of the amendment, was part and parcel of the presentation on Bill number 11, which was introduced in the 34th Guam Legislature. So information was received, the legislation was publicly heard, and in that particular case, I'm asking our colleagues to consider adding this to the proposed amendment because it would reduce the cost of government operations under the general fund by approximately $503,000. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ogden. There is a motion to overrule the decision of the chair. We'll now take the vote. All those in favor of overruling the decision of the chair, please signify.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Please reiterate the ruling of the chair one more time.
Okay. After consultation with legal counsel, this amendment before us is not germane to the bill that's before us at this point.
And the ruling of the chair is to be consistent with the recommendation.
That's
from
correct. And so the question now before the body is if you would overrule the decision of the chair. Okay? So all those in favor of overruling the decision of the chair, please signify by raising your hands. Okay. Okay, let me just make this very clear. There was a question posed to the chair, and the question was whether to make a determination whether the amendment before us is germane to the bill before us, which is Bill 248-34. And so after consultation with legal counsel, it is the ruling of the chair that this amendment is not germane to Bill 248-34. And so there was a motion to overrule the decision of the chair, and so that's the question before the body at this time. So we'll do it again. All those in favor of overruling the decision of the chair, please signify by raising your hands. 1, 2, 3. Motion fails. Senator Uggan, you still have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Then, Mr. Chairman, as we reflect on revenue enhancement on the piece of legislation that we have before us, Bill 248-34, I believe by virtue of the decision that you just previously rendered with regards to non-germaneness of a particular provision that would have realized a cost reduction in the government of Guam, then there's really going to be no balancing provision in this legislation moving forward, because I understand that there are also possible amendments to ensure that this government realizes a cost reduction of anywhere from $30 to $37 million based on previous discussions and figures that was provided by the administration. So even if those cost reduction measures were proffered on the floor, then the chair, in terms of being consistent, may also rule those items non-germane. So that being the case, Mr. Chairman, I move for the previous question that we proceed with the voting of Bill number 248-34.
Okay, we do have other amendments. However, I believe a motion calling for the previous question takes is priority to these amendments, and unless I'm corrected by legal counsel. We'll take a brief recess. The committee of the whole is back on now. There was a motion for the previous question. However, Senator Uggan, there was no previous question before us unless you would like to rephrase your motion.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I was just, a number, Sergeant at Arms circulated several amendments that a number of our colleagues wanted to also proffer on this piece of legislation, so I'd like to rescind my motion for the movement to the previous question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great. Thank you very much, Senator Uggan. Okay, so we have Senator San Augustine and Senator Esteves have circulated several amendments. We have one from Senator Lee. If I may recognize Senator Lee first. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Colleagues, I know we've been at this for quite some time, and I just wanted to remind the members of this body that we did receive a request when the Trump tax cuts were initially beginning to roll out, when they started to come down. And we had communicated to the director of the Department of Administration then, Ms. Balatu, that this body would be open to making the requisite cuts, that we were open to cutting funding for senatorial offices, cutting funding to the Office of Finance and Budget. And, you know, I think in a lot of the back and forth between the governor's office and the legislature, that's been left out. A lot of people think that we are moving forward and that none of us are going to be impacted. And that couldn't be further from the truth. We've communicated it to DOA, again to Director Boleto. We communicated it to BBMR that we were willing to make a cut, and the chairperson of legislative operations, we had a meeting, and he also sent out a memo to all the senatorial offices, just letting them know that to expect a 10% cut across the board. So my office, we made adjustments on our side. I know many of the members of this body have had to do that. I also just wanted to remind my colleagues and remind the public that several months ago, I believe in the month of June, we passed the pay raise rollback, and immediately we also passed Bill 94, which took our raises, the thousands of dollars from our raises, and we brought that money into the Department of Education for maintenance or repairs at our schools. So oftentimes we're asked, as public servants, put your money where your mouth is. And I'm really proud that we were able to do that, Mr. Chair, that we were able to take literally money from our own pockets. Members of this body gave $30,000 of their annual salary back into the community, into our classrooms for our school children. And I think that this motion, or this amendment that I'm about to proffer, is consistent in our attempts to continue to live within our means. We know what that means here at the legislature. We know what that means as public servants, and we take that to heart. And so I'd like to proffer this amendment, which would be a new section added to this bill, which would provide for a 10% reduction in fiscal year 2018 general fund appropriations to the Guam legislature, to the Office of Finance and Budget, and to the Office of the Governor. And so sections 1 and 2 will be amended to read, and we've passed out the amendment for all of my colleagues to review. And so we're basically making a reduction in the appropriation in the sum of what was initially about $8.5 million down to $7.6 appropriated from the general fund to Iles Litur and Guahan. The sum of $470,000 down to $423,000 for the Office of Finance and Budget. And the sum of $8,125,000 down to $7.3 million for the office of Imagalahin Guahan. And I'm offering this amendment because if this sales tax bill ends up passing tonight or tomorrow, and we didn't do everything in our power to cut certain parts of our government and to be that example and lead by example, I don't blame the public for being outraged. We need to show a balanced approach. And for that reason, Mr. Chair, I implore my colleagues to please support this amendment. We need to lead by example. We need to lead by example in this branch, and we need to call on the governor to please join us in this. And so again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chair, for the work that you've already done with legislative operations to prepare our branch to do this. And again, I want to thank my colleagues in advance for their support. Sidus Masi.
Thank you very much, Senator Lee. Before I recognize anyone, I just would like the body to know for the record that as chair, I'm providing maximum latitude on the amendments. I won't rule sua sponte whether they are germane or not unless a member of the body raises the question. So we just want to put that on the record. Senator Ada, you're recognized.
So, Mr. Chair, I'm just wondering, how is this amendment different from the one that was ruled down previously, which proposed some expenditure reductions? So maybe if you can just give a ruling so that we maintain some kind of consistency.
Thank you very much, Senator. Senator, is the question before the chair now whether to make a ruling on this amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Chair, after consulting with legal counsel, it appears that this amendment is not germane. However, I'll place it before the body, and if the body wishes to overrule my ruling, then that would stand. So I am ruling that it is not germane to the bill before us. So all those who wish to overrule the decision of the chair, please signify by raising your hands. Senator Lee, did you have anything before we take the vote? Was that? Oh, I think, yeah, there is a motion. Okay. So all those who wish to overrule the ruling of the chair, please signify by raising your hands. Okay. Motion passes to overrule the chair. So we can go and move on and discuss this. Senator San Nicolas?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had a question for the mover of the amendment. Are these amounts consistent with the amounts that were reflected in the governor's fiscal realignment plan that he transmitted to Legislatura?
Senator, would you yield?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, absolutely, and I thank my colleague for that question. It's my understanding that they are consistent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In light of that, the fiscal realignment plan intends to recognize appropriations reductions throughout this government in order to bring us closer to the $67 million shortfall. This amendment only covers the legislature, the Office of Finance and Budget, and the Office of the Governor. Since we've already voted to entertain these fragments of the fiscal realignment plan, I'd like to make an amendment to the amendment to include the entire fiscal realignment plan as the amendment to the amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, there's a motion to include the entire fiscal realignment plan. I would assume the body would like to see a copy of that. So if we can take a brief recess. Committee of the Whole is now back on. Senator San Nicolas, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as part of these discussions, the governor transmitted a fiscal realignment plan to the body that illustrates a number of reduced appropriations in order to realize certain savings as a part of this effort to get us to the amount necessary to cover the shortfall. The amendment that was proffered by the mover addresses reduced amounts for Ilasitura Guahan, the Office of Finance and Budget, and the Office of Megalahan Guahan. Those are only 3 object categories in the entire fiscal realignment plan as transmitted by the governor. And so I'm proposing an amendment to the amendment to keep the amounts and the language in the amendment as so moved, but to add all other items that are not currently in this amendment as an amendment to the amendment, all other items of the governor's fiscal realignment plan. And depending on how that amendment to the amendment moves, Mr. Chairman, if it does pass and it does so amend this amendment, I would like to at that time go back in and address certain specific line items if it is so adopted. So my amendment to the amendment is to adopt the fiscal realignment plan, the remaining sections within the fiscal realignment plan that are not already covered in the current amendment.
Thank you, Senator San Nicolas. And just to be clear, the motion is to adopt the fiscal realignment plan that the governor provided, his representatives provided us, those that are not included in Senator Lee's initial amendment. Okay? Everyone okay with that? Any discussion or amendments? Are there any objections to Vice Speaker?
Thank you. Hello. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I object to the motion as is because it's true, the governor submitted a fiscal realignment plan, but when it was submitted, I remember we had much discussion on this floor, and I agreed to that we have to show, or the government has to show that we are going to cut $47 million. However, it was very clear from the fiscal realignment plan that they had pretty much not used the scalpel, but used the bush cutter, as someone likes to tell us during our public hearings, and they had just pretty much cut across the board, percentages. And while that might work for, branches, I think for departments, it absolutely does not work, because I think we, try to appropriate based on priorities and looking at very many factors. I think it's very clear that in the fiscal realignment plan, they were intending to cut the Department of Education by $24 million, which is 7.97%. And the back and forth with DOE is very clear that DOE was immediately able to find $12 million in places that they could cut. They claim, it seems to me, that any additional cuts over $12 million are very difficult for them, that it might impact classrooms, and in fact their letter last week was threatening layoffs of their part-time teachers or their limited term teachers, and I'm sure that no one in here wants this. The problem is, we just need more work on that reprioritizing of even the money within the agencies. And we know that the like our furlough laws and rules, they've done that kind of work. It tells us what the priorities are going to be. It tells us that it's going to be done on an agency by agency basis. They're going to prioritize health, safety, and education, and they're going to prioritize, classified over unclassified employees in terms of who gets furloughed first, who gets laid off first. And we've also seen that, so it was a very big point when the fiscal realignment plan was submitted to us that in addition to the 7.97% that DOE is being cut, public safety was just being kind of chopped across the board, 6.63%, public health, 5.43%, and all other executive branch agencies only 2.94%. In the end, I just think, everybody's being put in fear of furloughs while we are looking, and I think still it's the public sentiment, and it's definitely my sentiment, that there are places in the government that we can cut, and I think we can even cut enough without furloughing, and we can meet this 47 million, but just to adopt their entire fiscal realignment plan, I think gives the public no assurance, and especially, agencies like DOE gives them no assurance as to how we are going to proceed after today. So we would be putting taxes on the people, a 2% sales tax. Some of our poorest families would have to pay that for all purchases, and we would be cutting our Department of Education. That's not going to make any sense to people, I don't think. I think we can hold DOE to the 12 million that does not affect classrooms, and that we can find, we're going to have to adjust this, obviously, if the governor is not able or willing to do that. And so that's the only reason I oppose the amendment. Otherwise, holding them to $47 million in cuts, absolutely. I think that's responsible, and that actually, I agree with the mover of the amendment, that's a prong that is absolutely necessary. I think we've all believed that from the start. You can't raise taxes on people. If you're going to raise a tax, then you absolutely better show the cuts to the government. So while I agree to showing $47 million in cuts, I just think adopting the fiscal realignment plan puts some of these agencies at great risk of being cut without much care or, thought being put into what the priorities really are. So, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Speaker. There was an objection to the amendment. Anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? Senator Morrison?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mentioned many times that I believe that the governor's fiscal realignment plan should be addressed, but I don't think this is the setting we should be going by with this. I think a lot of agencies, absent a public hearing, I think, and not having these agencies that will be impacted, in particular, our agencies such as DOE, GPD, Fire, our healthcare agencies. I think I'm not certainly opposed to the mover of this amendment moving to address the fiscal realignment, but I think, absent these agencies coming in and not knowing what the impact is to their agency, I'm just very concerned that we're inserting this fiscal realignment into a sales tax measure. I think we should handle this through a process separate from this sales tax measure before us, and I'd like to work with the author or the mover of this amendment in a separate setting. So I hope the author or the mover of this amendment could reconsider. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Castro, Esteves, and Agan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also agree with the previous speakers. In light of the passage of the amendment to Senator San Augustino's bill for the reorganization, I stand with Senator Morrison in reserving the right of this body to further prioritize the needs of the government. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Esteves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this amendment and the intent of this amendment. I think we have the option as a deliberative body to go both ways. When we went through the deliberation process of budgeting these agencies, it was with a projection which we know now we're not going to make, hence the shortfall. I think deliberative actions and austerity measures need to be taken, and the fiscal realignment plan was put out from Adelup and provided to the legislature to act upon if we so choose. We can always go back, Mr. Chairman, and with surgical precision to either cut or to reappropriate. I think once we start seeing, if 248 passes, we're going to start seeing revenues coming in based on the new tax, and then based on these trackings, we can make new projections. Based on these new projections, we can reappropriate up some of these agencies based on whether or not we can afford it and based on what our new priorities are. 248, Mr. Chairman, really started out as one page, and what it's turned into, and I'm happy to see, is a fairly comprehensive plan from this body moving forward. And we tackle the three major things, what I've been saying since the beginning, the 3 R's. Reduce, revenues, and reorganize. Furthermore, Mr. Chairman, that's what the people have been asking for. They want us to cut, but they don't want us to cut unreasonably. They want us to reorganize, but they don't want us to reorganize unreasonably. And they don't mind contributing to government of Guam and paying more taxes, but they don't want it to be unreasonable. And I think all of these concessions that we all make this process more reasonable to the people we're serving. So it might not be pretty at this time. It might be a little bit sloppy. But nothing we're doing here today is nothing we cannot revisit. But I think as long as the bones of what this body intends to do moving forward with 248 is, then I think we're going to be okay, Mr. Chairman. So I do support this because for me, this is the third leg to make 248 a comprehensive solution moving forward.
Thank you, Senator Uggan, and then Senator Nelson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly appreciate the comments that have been made by a number of senators. You know, one of my concerns, Mr. Chairman, is a significant provision in here, subsection 26701, is going to impose, should this legislation pass, a 2% sales tax on our people, on our consumers. And with a sense of appreciation about the support that was received on the amendment on the reorganization, I certainly appreciate that, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, in terms of incorporating that into the legislation, because on the one hand, we have a proposal to increase revenues. On the other hand, we have a proposal to reorganize. But there's no cost cutting. The reorganization is going to take a deliberate process where the governor would formulate, through executive order, the opportunity to be able to reorganize this entire government, the agencies under his supervision. But there's no direct cost reduction. We have heard for the last 3 weeks that the executive branch said they identified, executive branch representatives, they identified approximately $47 million in cost reduction. $47 million. Of which $19.2 million is going to originate from the Guam Department of Education. Mr. Chairman, the Department of Education has already identified $12 million of cost reductions, real anticipated cost reductions in their budget expense for for the balance of this fiscal year. You and I and the general public may have just received notification that should no revenue enhancements be provided, that they're going to transition to phase 2 and start impacting personnel and the classroom. But there's nothing here, Mr. Chairman, inclusive of the reorganization amendment, that says $47 million will be reduced. And that's why I support the amendment. Because first and foremost, it was an open dialogue between the Office of Finance Budget, the Speaker Cruz's office, Special Economic Service, and representatives from the executive branch. There was a request for a fiscal realignment plan by the governor's office, and that's what the governor forwarded to this body. These are his ideas. These are his concerns. Now it's our job to look at this and make sure that if we're going to take money out of the hard-earned pocketbooks of our people and our small businesses, or actually the consumers, then we need to do our part. We need to cut costs. We need to make sure that the governor's fiscal realignment plan is considered, that we look at the numbers. I know that one of the previous speakers mentioned about the hit on education, and I agree. $19.2 million out of the Department of Education with a balance of 5 or 6 months of this fiscal year is a challenge. And we already see it with the proposal by the Superintendent of Education, where 12.1 affects the procurement of new textbooks. 12.1, reduction in Department of Education budget, affects the the pre-K. Start at least delays it. But now, when we're talking about transitioning, we need to consider the governor's cost reduction. Because this would hold, the proposed amendment would hold the governor's feet to the fire. He asked the judiciary of Guam to reduce their budget funding allocation by $3.6 million or $3.5 million. They came up with a budgetary reduction of 3.5. They asked this body, under your oversight, Mr. Chair, with operations, to reduce the budget by $1 million. We are owning up, or the legislature is owning up to that reduction. Now we need to consider and make sure that those numbers are adopted so that, in fact, they restrict any expenditures of these agencies outside of those reductions, with the exceptions or modifications made by this body. That's why, Mr. Chairman, I support the amendment to incorporate the governor's fiscal realignment plan into this proposal so that it would hold this government's feet to the fire and ensure that for the balance of this fiscal year, whether we want to refer to it as $30 million or $47 million cost reduction, that is what is going to be realized, and that's what our people expect. So we have a three-legged stool. We have the funding mechanism, we have the reorganization tool that the governor will have should this legislation pass, and then the overall budgetary reduction allocation for these respective agencies. Do I agree with the reduction in the DOE of 19.2? No. But this, by accepting the amendment, we can now go in and modify those numbers so that, in fact, it reflects the true priority of this body, which really should be education, public safety, and healthcare. So I ask our colleagues to support the governor's fiscal realignment plan to be incorporated into this legislation before we proceed any further. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Uggan. Senator Nelson has the floor, and then if she'll yield the remaining time.
Just, I don't know, it's a point of information, but if the previous speaker would help me understand, I'm looking at the fiscal realignment plan, Mr. Chairman. On page 3, it's explicit. So if this is a document we're looking to append, I just have a question for the previous speaker, if he would yield. My question would be, or is he acknowledging that we're going to adopt a $24 million reduction for the Department of Education, notwithstanding the possibility of passing a 2% sales tax, that this is the number we're going to adopt as a body, if he would yield?
Just a point of order, Mr. Chairman. I'm the mover of the amendment to the amendment. I think it'd be more suited for me to answer the question.
Sure, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the previous speaker mentioned, this is step one. The next step after we agree to do this is to go in and power down the chainsaw and pull out the scalpel. And after we agree that we're going to look at these numbers as a part of passing this bill, we're going to go in and make the adjustments necessary. So no, I don't agree with 24 million. I think that there's actually some options that we can exercise to fix that. But procedurally, you cannot amend an amendment to the amendment. And so I'm first trying to get us to put this on the table. And then once we're there, then we can go in and begin maneuvering the amounts around the way we think are necessary. But at the very least, I want us to put cuts into the measure, not just tax increases. Mr. Chair.
Does that answer the question, Senator?
Not exactly. So if I could just, maybe direct the question one more time to the previous speaker too. Are we moving to adopt the $24 million Department of Education cut as a first step to append to the bill? It's just a yes or no.
Do you yield to the question, Senator?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. The first step is to adopt all of the numbers the governor's put forward, which does include that 24 million. That's step one. Step two is we go in and we begin making adjustments from there. But we can't make the adjustments to that until we take step one. So yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Senator Nelson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Although I do agree with the intent of the amendment, or to add it in, I just want to remind my colleagues, this fiscal realignment plan came into place in the midst of the 2% BPT bills that were presented us by the governor himself. And in this measure, just so that we're all on the same page, as the good senator, I don't know where you're from, but the good senator mentioned that it is not $19 million to DOE, it is $24.31 million to DOE, $8 million from public safety, and $5.93 million for public health. And these essential areas, the area, public safety, health, and education that should be prioritized, that we should look to spare, are the ones that are the very front of the chopping block. And so what I'm hoping is that as a body, we can look at the fiscal realignment plan in a separate measure and really apply the proper methodical and meticulous approach, because the way these numbers are put really questions the priority of the legislature. Now, I support to, taking another look at the fiscal realignment plan, but who's to guarantee that when we vote this amendment as part of the bill that we're going to have enough votes to support the changes in the numbers, most especially because we don't know what the numbers really are now. These are the numbers from February, and this is another thing, a caveat to the sales tax bill. We don't have a side conversation I had with a colleague. We don't have a tax expert really guiding us in these decisions that we are going to make that will impact our island, other than the director who is appointed by the governor from DRT. But I do want to look at this fiscal realignment plan, and I understand that there are pending legislation or pending bills that address this fiscal realignment plan in a more meticulous, methodical order than this that was presented to us in February. And I felt personally this was a means to force our hand to vote for the 2% BPT. And so I respectfully object this amendment.
Just a point of information, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
With reference to the numbers that were shared with us by the previous speaker, she is absolutely right. $24.3 million for all education agencies. If you go to specifics, because in my opinion, UOG and GCC have in my opinion, absorbed the cuts, I did not make reference to them. I made reference to the Department of Education and the number that was provided by the Office of Finance and Budget of $19.2 million. So that's where my reference of 19.2 for the Department of Education came in, exclusive of UOG and GCC. So thank you for that point of information, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator, for the point of information. Senator Nelson, you still have the floor. You're good. Senator Espadon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, what is before us right now is an amendment to an amendment. And the amendment to this amendment is to include the whole fiscal realignment plan, of which there seems to be a lot of mixed feelings in, and of which the author or the mover of the amendment to the amendment is saying, well, this is the first step. The second step would be then to, I guess, go in and start making the precision cuts that we need to do. I would proffer that perhaps we should let the original amendment, which just basically addresses the legislature, the executive branch, and the Office of Finance and Budget, to stand by itself. And then perhaps the wise thing to do then would then be to proffer another amendment that would then adopt the fiscal realignment plan. And that way, if there needs to be an amendment to that potential amendment, that could take place then and there. That way we don't have to wait correspondingly for what if this doesn't pass or what if that doesn't pass and things like that. The amendments can be made to the one substantive amendment that would be made relevant to the fiscal realignment plan. So I would ask the mover of the amendment to the amendment to perhaps proffer that amendment in a separate piece, and let's just deal with the amendment before us, which just deals with the legislature, the executive offices, the Office of the Governor, and OFB. And I ask the mover of the amendment to the amendment perhaps consider that, and then we can go and discuss his amendment to amendment. Because it's so significant, it shouldn't just be an amendment to the amendment. It should be a substantive part, I believe, going forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator. Are there any other senators? Senator Morrison, and then we'll go back to the mover.
Mr. Chair, now that I kind of understand the mover's position, is more to first incorporate this into the existing measure, but again, I'm concerned that normally when we go through this budget process, the budget call is submitted to or is put out to the agencies, and they provided that input and to develop the executive budget and sent down to the legislature to be addressed. But through that process, Mr. Chair, we ensure that we call each agencies in to still defend their budget before the legislative body. And unless the mover of the amendment is going to proceed, I'm willing to support this amendment. Is willing to proceed since we are already in the committee of the whole, that we are going to call each agency down, ensure that they understand what's before them, and how this would impact their agencies, their operations, and personnel. So I think that's very, very important to know for the body. If the mover intends to bring each agency down, or each agency head, to ensure that we understand, or they understand what's before them. So again, now that I kind of understand what's happening here, I think it's important to if the mover of the amendment is going to move in that direction. Mr. Chair, again, we've always allowed agencies to come down despite the executive budget being provided to us. And I just want to make sure that these agencies know what's happening. These are significant cuts, and I think they need to know.
Thank you, Senator. There is an objection to this amendment to the amendment. There's also a call by one of our colleagues for consideration for the mover to consider. but we'll go on and continue until we make that determination. Senator Ada?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I recall distinctly when the fiscal team was down here and we were discussing the fiscal realignment plan. And he made it very clear that the cuts that were being proposed was based on input from the respective agencies. And the ones that did not provide input, which was the legislature, the judiciary, maybe a couple of others, but for the most part, those numbers were based on input from the departments in response to the question of how much can you give up? And these were the figures that came in. So I don't see why we would need to call the departments back in. These were informed decisions that were made based on input from the departments. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Ada. Anyone else? If not, we'll go back to the mover.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the statement from the retiring speaker. Let us remember that these figures, this is the governor's fiscal realignment plan. And in the beginning of this whole process, we were told of a circular that was transmitted by BBMR. We were told of them receiving input from various agencies. And one of the things that we held them to in the beginning was, give us your fiscal realignment plan. Go back to your agencies, put it all in writing, and bring it before this body. The governor has done that. That's the amounts that we're talking about here in this amendment to the amendment. So to have the agencies all come back in again is basically to have them revalidate what they've already affirmed to the Bureau of Budget and Management Research and to the governor's fiscal team. I agree with the retiring speaker. I don't think that's necessary at this point. If the agencies have already been consulted and that was the amounts that were transmitted by the governor, then that's the amounts for us to begin with. And I want to put on the record, Mr. Chairman, that over the course of these going on 4 weeks, we've entertained, I believe, almost nearly half a dozen bills to raise taxes. This is the first time that we're actually procedurally entertaining on this floor the steps necessary for us to realize any cuts. There's been a lot of talk of cuts, there's been talk of circulars, there's been talk of feedback from agencies, there's been a lot of talk, but there hasn't been any actual substantive items that were put before the body to actually make cuts a reality. Now, this amendment to the amendment, I'm including it with respect to the original amendment, which was just going to cut the legislature, the Office of Finance and Budget, and the Office of the Governor. And the reason why I'm maintaining this as an amendment to the amendment is because I don't want us to come back and say we piecemealed it. I don't want us to pass this original amendment and say we already did cuts and we cut over here and I'm good to go, because that's a possibility as well. I'm of the mind that we should pass this as an amendment to the amendment and then vote it up or down as to whether or not we're going to incorporate cuts into this overall bill. Because without this bill is just a tax increase bill, as were all the bills prior to it. And the reality is that we're dealing with a $67 million shortfall unless this tax increase bill raises the full $67 million. We're going to have a conversation about cuts. So I would like for us to, similar to how we've entertained reorganization and then went in and made all the necessary adjustments to it in order for it to become a palatable component of this tax consideration, we need to include the cut component. That has been missing from every single tax increase conversation. And I think that now is the time for us to make it be a part of this conversation, pass this amendment to the amendment, and then with the overall amendment, if we pass this amendment to the amendment and it becomes a part of the overall amendment, then we can go in and begin saying, do we want to keep these parts or do we want to change these other parts? If we don't do this, and if we don't incorporate the fiscal realignment plan or the cuts that it represents, and if we don't incorporate any cuts at all with the exception of these three that's in this original amendment, then we're going to be moving forward a tax increase bill, assuming it moves forward, a tax increase bill and saying, oh, we're going to cut later. And if we're doing the work now, let's do the work now and let's get ourselves the $67 million figure that we need to get to, because for us to just raise the revenue without addressing the cuts necessary, we're only going to be moving forward half of the necessary equation. And then what happens? And then our people get stuck with a tax increase while this government still doesn't initiate any cuts? How is that fair to our people? For me, to have me consider any kind of revenue enhancements, it's going to have to include provisions that are going to have cuts. So I humbly ask my colleagues to consider voting yes on this amendment to the amendment. It doesn't automatically become a part of the bill. It becomes a part of the overall amendment that we're going to be discussing thereafter. And then we can go in and talk about some surgical moves to make adjustments. One of them, by the way, would be the, on page 3 of the fiscal realignment plan, they still have a $12 million 2% general fund deficit reserve. I mean, that could easily go to reducing the Department of Education's liability, as an example. But we can't begin working on it until we actually agree to include it as part of the discussion. And that's what this amendment to the amendment will do. It will actually put cuts into the discussion. It's been weeks, and I think it's time that we've begun bringing the whole picture together as opposed to just discussing tax increases. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. On the amendment to the amendment, there was an objection. Senator Ogden?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm kind of perturbed about something that I just received and is being disseminated by representatives of the administration, and they're fabricating the discussion here. And it's an outright lie. It's saying that, in fact, Senator St. Nicholas, Senator Ogden are moving an amendment to cut an incredible $24 million from the Department of Education. Mr. Chairman, the fiscal realignment plan originated from the governor's office. It is their proposal, $24 million. And I said specifically in this discussion that the 19.2 out of DOE I have concerns about. So for the front office to distribute a press release that asserts that Senator St. Nicholas and myself, who we both have always advocated for prioritizing education, that in fact we want to reduce the budget for DOE by $24 million, that's an outright lie, Mr. Chairman. An outright lie. So I wanted to clarify that for the record. It's about the process here, accepting the proposed amendment, which is the governor's fiscal realignment plan, that would have reduced education by $24.3 million, and then, like the mover of the amendment, we can go agency by agency and revisit those numbers. So I certainly hope that whoever is providing all these press releases, because I believe in the governor, I don't think that is something that he's going to fabricate based on our conversation. He knows that at the end of the day, we want to support education. But to make an outright lie and send out a press release is completely uncalled for. And I say it's an outright lie, because even the sponsor, the mover of the amendment, has stated that we can go in, make the accept the amendment, and then make the appropriate adjustment. And I also said something similar. So, Mr. Chairman, I think it's very, very unfortunate that you have representatives of this government coming out with press releases that is not reflective of the entire conversation. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for that point of personal privilege. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator.
Point of personal privilege also, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman, if I may be afforded the opportunity. Mr. Chairman, we're approaching this issue as statesmen. We are seriously trying to take the circumstances that we are being presented and that's being presented to our people, the very same circumstances that's closing fire stations, the very same circumstances that's prompting letters informing employees that they're going to have furloughs. We're taking all of those circumstances and we keep entertaining multiple versions of tax increase bills in this body because we're trying to address what we're being sold as a fiscal crisis. And yet, Mr. Chairman, when we have bad faith actions like this that take the very governor's own fiscal realignment plan that he sent down here, and all of a sudden starts pressing it out, saying that we're the ones who are trying to cut something, I lost count of how many times we had so many officials come in here and sit before this body and say they're here in good faith. We have a crisis, we need to come together. I mean, the governor himself keeps going on in the media and saying we need to come together, we need to resolve this, this is in the hands of the legislature. And yet as we try and make an effort to move forward with addressing the full $67 million shortfall, which is supposed to include $37 million in cuts, now that we're discussing those very cuts that the governor himself committed to, all of a sudden, these kind of things are being put out. Which only leads me to believe, Mr. Chairman, that these cuts that we're being told are going to happen is a disingenuous statement. If all of a sudden mandating these things and a measure that's going to increase taxes on our people is going to be pushed forward as a bad thing, or to try and discourage members of this body from adopting it, that can only lead me to conclude that there is no serious commitment to make cuts as a part of this fiscal crisis. And if that's the case, then I am not interested whatsoever in raising taxes on our people if this government is not in a serious fiscal crisis. If it is, and we need to make these cuts, then let's have a full discussion about raising revenue and having these cuts implemented. If it's not, then let's not raise taxes on our people. This is the kind of stuff that sets us back every time we come in here and we try and make a statesman's effort to resolve this problem. I don't understand how the administration expects this body to be able to move forward when, in trying to move forward, encompassing all of the information that's been provided over these many weeks, all of a sudden it's going to be turned into a political battlefield of, oh, you're cutting something. There's a lot of, especially on my end of the table, I'll speak for myself, Mr. Chairman, because I've been doing this for a number of years already. I already struggle to believe the boy who cried wolf over and over again as to the depth of this crisis. For years, Mr. Chairman, I've seen us being brought in here and be told that GMH doesn't have supplies, they don't have blood, we need to borrow money, and then all of a sudden, we're able to cut $30 million when we have a fiscal crisis. And those cuts could have happened to help GMH back then, and instead we went out and floated bonds because the boy who cried wolf told us that people are going to die. That same modus operandi has brought crisis management issues before this body over and over and over again, and we've passed so many measures that, in my opinion, were not in the best interest of our people, but I know many members of this body just went with it because there's a crisis and people are going to die. That's happened over and over and over again, and it's proven to have just been the same fable of the boy who cried wolf. And so here we are now. And I know, Mr. Chairman, I know that we have to make some fiscal adjustments. I'm not denying that. But with all of that bad credibility, we're trying now to take what we're given, put that aside, and work as statesmen for our people, and we're just getting the same mess. I am not interested in raising any taxes on our people if we cannot come back also and show our people that this government is making the cuts necessary for there to be equity. I am also not interested, Mr. Chairman, in raising taxes on our people and making cuts that are not necessary. And actions like this make me seriously question whether or not any of this is necessary. And what's unfortunate is that we're being dragged through a game of brinksmanship where they're causing the maximum amount of pain up front in order to just cause this body to fold. I'm proud of this body that we've been holding the line. I'm proud of this body that we're even willing to consider looking at the governor's fiscal realignment plan and trying to figure out how we can make the numbers work in a level that we're comfortable with. And it saddens me that as we enter into the final half of what is a 2-year term for this governor, his people still can't get it. That if you want to come before this body and expect us to respond to the crisis that you're putting our people through, and respond to this crisis that you are saying is a reality, then you need to treat the facts with respect. It's the only way that we're going to provide the services necessary in here for our people, and it's just very, very sad. So I rise to a point of personal privilege, Mr. Chairman, because I wanted to express that I am seriously making every effort I can to ignore all of those false flags of the past and address this issue now. But if in so trying to, we're just going to be dealt that hand, how do we know what's real and what's not anymore? Even the governor's own fiscal realignment plan now, his own people are turning around and saying that these are horrendous cuts when they were the ones that transmitted it to this body. I mean, in all seriousness. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator San Nicolas. You've closed already on your amendment. He's closed, and so there was an objection to it, unless there's a point of personal...
Point of order.
Point of order? Yes,
not a
state
point
your-
of personal privilege.
Okay.
Just a point of order. It's very confusing, Mr. Chair, that we're talking about this 148-page or 46 pages, pretty much a bill that the governor has sent down as a fiscal realignment plan, and they were going to adopt this in one fell swoop. And I'm not even sure everybody has this in front of them, but I feel like if anybody thinks we're going to have discussion on it after this amendment passes, that's very confusing to me. I think the discussion on this has to be now. This is the language we're going to put into the bill as is, and this is the time to, if we're serious about going through it, to go through it, or admit that we're not going to be able to go through it after this amendment passes. So that's my point of order, Mr. Chair. I think when we pass this amendment, we are adopting the 146 pages of the bill and putting it into our bill.
Just a point of order and point of information, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Go ahead, Senator.
First, on the point of information, the amendment is to adopt the figures in the governor's fiscal realignment plan, with the exception of the figures that were presented in the original amendment. So it's not the entire fiscal realignment plan; it's the figures. Anything that has a number attached to it is what's being presented as the amendment to the amendment. Secondly, on the point of order, Mr. Chairman, if we pass this amendment to the amendment, then we are on the amendment. And it's at that point, it's not a part of the bill yet, it's still the amendment, and from there, we have a full amendment that includes not just the original language provided by the author of the amendment, but every other amount that's in this fiscal realignment plan will be thereafter included. And so to answer the question of the previous speaker, no, passing this amendment to the amendment will not automatically incorporate this into the bill. It will make it a part of the original amendment, and then from there, we can have the conversation about how to discuss the cuts as proposed. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
That's the first I've heard about the figures, Mr. Chair. I've only heard, and this amendment was to incorporate the fiscal realignment plan, and I'm not
Okay.
sure where.
So just to be clear with everyone, the original amendment is to adopt the figures on the fiscal realignment plan, aside from what is on the initial amendment. So that's the first amendment, and if there is an objection, yeah, there is.
Mr.
Senator San
Chairman,
Augustine.
I'm just looking over at my colleagues, and I see it's a summary, review, and analysis. I'm looking at the Vice Speaker. She's looking at the thicker document.
The bill.
Which one are we discussing? Because you can't just separate one from the other. Just because the Office of Finance comes up with their own analysis doesn't mean that it's the right thing. When we look at what the governor submitted, it's a real thick document. It's this thick, and it
That's right.
identifies agency and it got numbers, okay?
And I believe that is what the mover's intention is.
Which one is it?
Senator San Nicolas, if you can correct that it is the bill that was submitted, and the figures in that bill is what is being amended to this amendment.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I think what the retiring speaker or the speaker is referencing is the fiscal realignment plan summary and review analysis. That's just a snapshot of the actual fiscal realignment plan as transmitted by Imagit Lahi. And so I'm asking that we incorporate the amounts, with the exception of those already written in the original amendment, the remaining amounts of the fiscal realignment plan as transmitted by Imagit Lahi.
Okay, so is that clear? There is an objection on the amendment to the amendment. All those in favor?
Mr.
Yes,
Chair,
Senator.
just to be precise about the amendment to the amendment, the language is what?
Okay, the amendment is to take the governor's fiscal realignment plan bill, the bill that he submitted to us.
I understand the concept.
Okay.
The language to me is what's important.
Okay, so I'm going to get to it.
What is the language?
Okay, I'm going to get to it. So it's the
Okay.
bill that he transmitted, the figures on that bill, where he makes a reduction on the individual agencies. That is what is being included into Senator Lee's amendment before us.
No, I understand. But the amendment to the amendment that's being proffered, the words to that are what? I would believe it's probably just a one sentence. Is it adopt the figures for the fiscal realignment plan?
Yes, that is. And
That-
Senator, if you
that's-
can restate that.
That's all it is for the 20.
Yes.
Yeah, and I just want a restatement of the wording
Yes.
of the amendment to the amendment. I understand what we're looking at.
Okay.
In essence, just to make clear for those who are watching, that the realignment plan is really just a resubmittal of the budget bill that we had passed previously.
Yes.
And what the governor did send down was a corrected version, or that basically reduces the amount of some of the appropriations to the various agencies. That is the realignment plan. The only thing I'm interested in, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, is to make sure that the language is proper of this amendment to the amendment.
Okay.
So, what is the language?
Okay. Senator San Nicolas?
Mr. Chair, I would ask to deliberate on this amendment, that we call in OFB, we call in whichever parts of this 146-page document we're actually going to address, that we just get in whoever we need. And I would suggest that we need OFB to, like he said, this is a budget bill.
All I was asking for, Mr. Chair, was the exact language of the amendment to the amendment. And if I may speak to that issue that was just brought up, and that is that OFB is not necessary unless we adopt it.
Okay. There's a request to bring in OFB and the other agencies. But before we do that, Senator, can you just state one more time what the amendment is, the language on the amendment, just to be clear for everybody?
Just a specific
Yes,
language
specific.
for the amendment to the amendment that we're adding into this amendment.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, it's an amendment to the amendment to include the figures within the governor's fiscal realignment plan as transmitted to legislatura, with the exception of those figures that are a part of the original amendment. So all the other figures of all the other agencies and instrumentalities, except for the legislature, OFB, and the office of the governor, which is the original amendment. All the other figures, that is on the table.
I understand the intention of that amendment. All I'm asking for is the exact language that would be added to this amendment. Maybe if you could just take a minute to write it out so we'll know what it says. Words mean something, and if the words are misplaced or perhaps are incorrectly used, then perhaps the intention may not be achieved.
Okay, sure. So, Senator, can you please just have that one sentence written out, please?
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll ask the senator to do that. While we ask that, I think there's a senator that wants to be recognized. Senator San Augustine?
You know, throughout the day, same question was brought up. Is it germane?
if this amendment is germane to the bill?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take
Yes, sir.
a 1
I'm
minute.
just
Sure.
curious, because every now and then, somebody would ask that question, and it's not, just want to make
Okay.
sure.
Well,
Point of order, Mr.
Yes.
Chairman. With all due respect, the chairman has allowed for the discussion over the course of the last 20, 30 minutes.
Sure.
So that's an indirect acceptance of the proposal that is before us. So this idea about asking germaneness is, in my opinion, an inappropriate inquiry, because we've already been discussing this particular amendment for an extensive period of time. So thank
Okay.
you, Mr. Chairman.
We're going to take a brief recess. The Committee of the Whole is back in session. There was a question posed on the germaneness of the amendment to the amendment. And pursuant to standing rules, the question on germaneness may be brought up at any time prior to the bill heading to the third reading. And so the question before us now is whether this amendment is germane. And after consultation with the legal counsel, it is my ruling that the amendment to the amendment is not germane. However, I place it before the body, and the body may move to overrule the decision of the chair. Is there a motion to overrule the decision of the chair, Senator? Okay, there is a motion. All those in favor of overruling the decision of the chair, please signify by raising your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, motion carries to overrule the decision of the chair. There is a request to get OFB and all the agencies here. Yes, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a point of inquiry. I mean, do we need the agencies in regards to the governor's fiscal realignment plan? I mean, we have the numbers. I think we've reached a point where, in fact, we've seen that extensively. We really should be making appropriate amendments. Once this is adopted, should it be adopted by the body? So
Okay.
that's my suggestion. I understand the Vice Speaker was asking for OFB, and I think that OFB would be very appropriate considering that we're looking at the numbers itself. But in terms of the agencies, I would just ask to reconsider.
Thank
you,
you.
Mr.
We'll clarify the request. Vice Speaker, is the request just for OFB?
That's my request. And if we could just clarify which pages we are talking about in this bill
Okay.
that are the figures.
Okay.
Point
So-
of order,
Yes.
Mr. Chair. And again, it goes back to my original request of what the language is of the amendment to the amendment that creates all of this.
Okay.
I mean, that everybody's speaking to right now.
Okay, thank you.
And that's all I'm waiting for.
Okay, we did request the mover to provide that written amendment, so we'll wait for that. We'll take a 5-minute recess and request OFB to please be brought in to the session hall. Representative from OFB. Senator San Augustine.
Mr. Chairman, after looking over the OFB's analysis, it talked about $47 million. Am I correct? It's $47 million shortfall that the governor's, no, 67 is the OFB. They said 67, the governor's office said 47.
Yeah.
No?
Senator, if we can, we'll take a 5-minute recess. We'll
Okay.
get the OFB representatives here. We'll take a 5-minute recess.